This time, I would like to look at the mysteries that were never clearly revealed until the very end of the Naruto story. First up is one of the most representative mysteries of Naruto, that jutsu. Right after the start of Part 2 of Naruto, before heading out on a mission to rescue Gaara, Jiraiya said something very meaningful to Naruto: "Don't use that jutsu." Coupled with the excitement of the start of Part 2, many readers were probably wondering what that jutsu was all about. However, even as the story progressed, Jiraiya's jutsu was never clearly revealed, and in the end, the true nature of that jutsu was never revealed. However, we can infer what that jutsu was from the various descriptions in the story. The most likely candidate is Miju. Miju can exert overwhelming power by utilizing her enormous chakra. Her power is so terrifying that even when the Nine Tails were in four-tailed form, Jiraiya felt his life was in danger. Furthermore, at the time, Naruto was unable to control this power, and it was extremely dangerous, attacking both friend and foe. Furthermore, Miju's power was also a sword of the various schools that consumed Naruto's own body to the point of draining his light. That's why many readers thought that Jiraiya banned the technique. And in actual scenes, that technique also appears in the conversation between Gamatra and Jiraiya in the Skull Frog and in the conversation between Gamatra and Naruto. There, it was suggested that that technique was a technique that would completely control Miju. Looking at this, the Miju theory seems quite likely. However, if you think about it carefully, there are several questionable points to this theory. First of all, the technique that Gamatra was talking about and the technique that Jiraiya banned are not necessarily the same. The times and situations in which he made the remarks are different, so it's entirely possible that he was referring to a different technique. To begin with, it would be more appropriate to say that Miju becomes a technique rather than a technique, but rather a characteristic of the Jinchuriki. In fact, for Naruto at the time, Miju was not a technique that he could activate intentionally, but rather a kind of manifestation caused by emotional excitement. To put it simply, it's a runaway state where he gains great power through the power of darkness, which is common in battle manga. Even if Jiraiya told him not to use it, would he go out of his way to ban something that Naruto can't control? Besides, Jiraiya would probably have said more directly, "Don't use the power of the Nine Tails." In other words, there are many parts of Niyoshi's theory that are hard to accept. So let's consider another possibility. Here, I want you to remember the meeting between Jiraiya and Naruto. Naruto was interrupted by Jiraiya during his training with the sullen helper Ebisu. When Naruto pressed him to take responsibility and train with him, Jiraiya said he didn't like men and ignored him completely. However, the moment Naruto showed off his seduction technique, he was impressed and immediately agreed to train with him. In other words, the origin of their designated relationship lies in the lewd element. As the story progresses and we think about it later, it was almost certain that Jiraiya would become Naruto's master from the moment Naruto was born, as he is Minato's son, a member of the Kyo clan, and Naruto's godfather. Their bond has definitely deepened through the seduction technique. And when we think about it again, Naruto's growth was quite subtle considering the 2.5 years of training. Of course, it is thought that the basics of his ninja mentality, taijutsu, ninjutsu, and genjutsu had grown considerably, but there was almost no visible growth. The only new technique he had was the slightly large spiral slash, and despite training intensively one-on-one with the legendary trio Jiraiya for 2.5 years, the results were far too few. However, considering that he spent the majority of his training on that technique, it makes sense that he had made little progress in other areas. From this, it can be inferred that that technique was the harem paradise technique, which goes beyond the okage technique and even goes beyond the harem technique. During the 2.5 years of training, Jiraiya must have instilled in Naruto the mindset of a pervert. Starting with bathing in the women's hot springs, he taught him various perverted techniques, and the combined power of these techniques may have been the harem paradise technique. The power of this technique is unimaginable, and if it were activated, it would surely render all men present, regardless of friend or foe, incapacitated. Because it was so destructive, Jiraiya ordered it to be sealed as that technique. Also, the fact that Naruto said something like, "That's the only technique," before using the sexual reverse harem technique he showed in the series adds to the possibility of this theory. This reverse harem technique was probably a derivative of that technique that Naruto came up with on his own. Or perhaps he really did follow Jiraiya's instructions until the very end and didn't use that technique. In other words, he can be said to be a model disciple who follows Naruto's orders. There are several theories like this, but in the end, the true nature of that technique was never clearly revealed. However, that is precisely why it continues to stimulate the imagination of readers and is still a beloved topic of discussion today. Whatever the truth, this mystery will surely continue to be solved in the future. Next is Sasuke's "Stop It" technique. This is what happened when Naruto and the others infiltrated Orochimaru's hideout in the beginning of Part 2 to bring Sasuke back. Naruto and the others desperately called out to Sasuke, who they hadn't seen in a long time, but Sasuke had completely developed the heart. Moreover, Sasuke at this time was considerably stronger than Naruto, and had enough power to single-handedly overwhelm the life-slashing squad and even hold back Kyo. In the midst of all this, the moment Sasuke raised his left arm straight up and attempted to activate some kind of jutsu, Orochimaru appeared in a panic and said, "Don't use that jutsu." He and Sasuke stood still. From the meaningful expressions on the two faces at that time and the eerie atmosphere that Naruto felt, it was clear that the jutsu he was about to use at that time was something terrifying. However, the true nature of this, "Don't use that jutsu," was never clearly revealed, and was left to the reader's imagination. So let's think about what this was. First, the most likely candidate is Kiri, which he later demonstrated in the Itachi line. Kiri is the ultimate lightning jutsu that controls natural lightning, and was Sasuke's trump card jutsu. It is thought to be Kiri due to the pose of raising his left arm straight up before activating the jutsu and the overwhelming power of the jutsu. However, there is a big problem here. Kiri is a technique that uses Ka to generate an updraft, creating a stone fortune and guiding the squid hammer that falls from the sky towards the opponent. In other words, in order to activate Kiri, it is necessary to create thunderclouds in the sky with a large-scale Ka in advance. However, there was no such preparation in advance during the battle at Orochimaru's hideout. Furthermore, the sky was not cloudy at all. It is physically impossible to activate Kiri under these circumstances. In other words, Kiri is not possible under the circumstances. However, the Kiri theory is not zero. After all, it is possible that Sa was seriously trying to activate Kiri at that time, but was so anxious that he forgot to prepare in advance. It is also possible that he was trying to take the upper hand as soon as possible by saying, "I've become so strong, but you guys are too weak," and that is what he was thinking. It is possible that Orochimaru, seeing Sa struggling to survive, realized that this was a bad situation and stopped him. In other words, it is also possible that the sperm was the kindness of his master, Orochimaru. As you can see, Kiri is a strong possibility, but other techniques are also possible. That's the player's first strike technique. The pose Sasuke held his arms straight up is the same as the pose of a player's sensei who stands up straight in sportsmanship. In other words, when we use this technique, we, the ninjas, are forced to follow the restriction that we swear to fight with dignity. However, this technique is a heavenly trick for a tangled-up user like Orochimaru, who specializes in tricks and non-strikes. That's probably why Orochimaru stopped him in a hurry. In any case, if Sasuke had activated his technique at that time, he would have written a red background with the technique, or an overseas ceremony would have been held. Next is about Sa being originally a genjutsu-type. Sasuke was heavily emphasized in the early part of the story, and there were many depictions of him being better at genjutsu than his peers, such as being certified as a genjutsu-type by his sensei, being the first to figure out that a genjutsu barrier had been set up at the exam venue, and breaking it with the genjutsu ambassador. Furthermore, Sano has another personality called Norusa, and there were many descriptions of the spiritual world. Since genjutsu is a technique that interferes with the opponent's mind, Sakura, who has a complex inner world, was a natural genjutsu type. However, Sano's talent did not fully develop until the end of Part 1, and as a result, she did not show any special achievements. After that, in Part 2, Sano trained under Suna and significantly powered up as a Karyoku medical ninja. However, her fighting style became completely brute force and muscle line, and there was no genjutsu element in it at all. However, since Kashi had once again evaluated Sakura as a genjutsu type in the Suzutori battle immediately after the start of Part 2, there was expectation that Sakura would become a Karyoku genjutsu medical ninja who surpassed Suna. Since she went to the trouble of impressing the readers with the setting that she was a genjutsu type once again, many readers must have expected that she would also be active in that area. However, even as the story progressed, Sano's fighting style remained brute force and muscle lines. Furthermore, since she could heal herself, she used the STEMI payment strategy, a fighting style that was the furthest thing from a genjutsu user. In other words, there was a big difference between Kashi's evaluation and the actual Sakura. Furthermore, in the second part, Uchiha Sa hardly appears, and the mental structure of the type who specializes in jutsu, which is different from others in terms of having a mental world, also disappeared. In this way, Sa hardly felt like a jutsu type, but if you chained allies, it becomes clear that she really was a jutsu type. It is seen as a type that is resistant to jutsu, rather than a type that uses jutsu. Certainly, if you look at the descriptions in the story, Sa herself rarely uses jutsu, and her jutsu is more effective in terms of seeing through or dispelling jutsu. In other words, it can be assumed that this setting was not utilized because Sakura herself rarely fought jutsu users. Perhaps even if she had been hit by Adachi Nissan's reading, Shayna's determination alone could have broken through the jutsu and she could have attacked the workplace. Another possible theory is that Sa was actually using jutsu. For example, by combining jutsu with medical jutsu, she may have been able to reduce the pain of the armed person and stabilize their mental state, thereby increasing the effectiveness of the medical jutsu to over 100%. It makes sense that even though he wasn't chosen by God like Haruto or Sa, nor did he come from a special bloodline, he was able to become a legendary medical ninja on par with Su, not just through simple medical techniques, but also through the use of genjutsu. Thinking about it this way, Sa's Kairyoku could also be a genjutsu. At the table, he showed destructive power, such as breaking the ground and sending enemies flying with the Kairyoku he inherited from Su. But it's possible that to his enemies it actually looked like more Kairyoku. It's possible that he used genjutsu that wasn't actually that powerful, but that made it feel many times stronger due to the genjutsu effect. In other words, it's possible that he was a true genjutsu user who mastered advanced genjutsu to the point where no one noticed. Sa is practically Funi's Kairyoku illusion gorilla. However, it's also possible that this was simply a change of direction on the part of Kishikage. It's certainly possible that at the beginning of the story and immediately after the start of part 2, the plan was to have Sakura grow as a genjutsu user. However, as the story progressed, it's possible that he ended up focusing solely on Kairyoku medical ninja as a more understandable fighting style, and that he ended up running through to the end. In the first place, I think it's much harder to depict frequent genjutsu battles within the constraints of serialization than it is to depict regular battles. That's probably why they shifted to more understandable and powerful kairiki battles. In other words, the setting that Saga is a genjutsu type is what genjutsu is all about. Next is the issue of Ishitani's age. When you compare the official age setting with the events in the story in the original series, there are parts that don't add up no matter how you calculate it. And there's also the problem that it's unrealistic for him to be able to do something like that at that age. Before considering these, let's first check Ishitani's background. He graduated from the academy in book form at the age of 7, was promoted to Chunin at the age of 10, and became the commander of Abe's Bun Squad at the age of 13. Then, at the age of 13, he completed the gruesome mission of destroying his clan, and immediately after that, he joined the major criminal group Akatsuki. When considering this original series, there are contradictions with other incidents. That is the incident where Orochimaru's Akatsuki body was taken over. Omaru tried to take over Ishitani's body, but was instead defeated by Ishitani, and as a result, he ended up leaving Akatsuki. According to the story within Akatsuki at the end of Part 1, this incident took place 7 years before the end of Part 1. Since Adachi was 18 years old at the end of Part 1, he would have fought Orochimaru 7 years earlier, at the age of 11. Here, a crucial contradiction arises within the own lineage. As I mentioned earlier, Adachi was 13 years old when he buried his clan, left Shuguru, and joined Akatsuki. In other words, Adachi, who is 11 years old and should not have joined Akatsuki yet, is somehow still affiliated with Akatsuki and is beating Orochimaru. This could be seen as a simple mistake, but if you think that this is where Adachi's greatest secret is hidden, it makes strangely sense. That secret is that Adachi's manji powerhouse, Hayashiga, has a third ability hidden within him: time and space manipulation. The theory is that while Obi no Kai transcends space, Itachi transcends the things of time and space. This would easily resolve this contradiction within the own lineage. It is not impossible to assume that the battle with Orochimaru took place before he joined Akatsuki, but that he was manipulating time and space. And it makes sense that he was able to overwhelm the legendary 3 at just 11 years old, considering that his future self was fighting through time-space manipulation. Even if Itachi Nisan was a genius who stood out among the Uchiha clan, it would have been impossible for him to defeat Orochimaru at the age of 5th grade. In fact, Itachi at that time did not look 11 years old at all. And since this time-space transcendence technique causes considerable damage to the body, it is also possible that Itachi received the buff in less than a second. This may also be the reason why his young brother, who was holding the baby, was already showing signs of difficulty. In fact, there is no way he could have displayed that kind of dignity at the age of 5. In this way, it can be considered that the inconsistency in Itachi Nisan's age was not just a mistake in the setting, but an inevitable phenomenon caused by his ability. In other words, we, the readers, were completely fooled by Itachi Nisan. However, the real truth is an ultimate secret that exists only in Kishikage-sama's heart. Perhaps Kishikage-sama, like Itachi Nisan, continued the series while harboring a secret that he could not reveal to anyone. Only those who have arrived at this truth will be able to reform the Manikyo Sharin.